My name's Ian Taylor, and I work here at Google, and I'm happy to present my father, Lance Taylor, who does not work at Google, but at the New School for Social Research. I've known my father for a long time. I think the most relevant story I can have for Google is that he was also the first person to pay me to do computer programming on various archaic systems, most of which proved that the economic models he was trying to build could not actually be done on the computers of the day. We could do them today, but he's kind of moved on to different areas anyhow. So, Lance Taylor.
Well, thank you very much. What I want to do today actually is talk about a fairly old-fashioned topic, despite the formidable title of the talk, which is what has to happen in a developing or transition economy if, in fact, poor people can get into a position which makes them a little bit better off. And sort of an appropriate place to start when you're talking about that, there's a summary here, which I'll skip since I'm sort of limited in time. But an appropriate place to start whenever you start to begin to talk about economics is, of course, Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith is a bit like Shakespeare and the Bible in the sense that you can find almost anything in the book, The Wealth of Nations, to support your point of view. And the point of view that I want to develop is the following, that the first part of The Wealth of Nations, the first 200 pages, roughly speaking, is essentially a defense of free market economics in a sort of strange way, which I can perhaps mention. And then the next several hundred pages about that, after that, essentially tell you how real economies work, or how the economy in Great Britain in the 1770s worked. And in some ways, it's not terribly different from the way economies work today. Because one thing that Smith emphasized is that economies, you can think about different producing sectors in an economy, one set of sectors would have increasing returns to scale or have the possibility of very rapid technical change, whereas another set of sectors would be decreasing returns to decreasing returns to scale. And in Smith's day, the contrast would be between industry and agriculture. What he had in mind by industry were the things like the famous pin factory, whereby instead of one guy doing all the steps to put the pin together, you would essentially have an assembly line operation, which was subject to decreasing costs in the sense that you can produce a lot of pins much more cheaply that way than you could in the traditional fashion. So the idea of economic development then is in a way to stimulate sectors with increasing returns and try to switch people out of decreasing returns into increasing return sectors. Now, that same notion was followed up in the US economy, of course, by Alexander Hamilton, who more or less invented what is now called a developmentalist model of economic growth. And that kind of growth model would essentially say that you should pursue very aggressively creation of sectors with economies of scale and try to design policies that would serve to that end. Now, during the 19th century, up until actually during the 19th century and actually up until the 1930s, the US was the most protectionist economy in the world. That is, tariffs 100%, 200% were not unknown, and there was also a great deal of natural protection. So Alexander Hamilton's idea was that you should push as hard as you possibly can to develop industries to compete, which would be on the same level as England, which of course served as a role model for all the subsequent economies. The US, if you think of what happened in the US, very high tariffs, state investment in the form of the Erie Canal, heavy government investment. Just to ask you a question, how many railroads were built between Chicago and Seattle? Does anybody know? There were essentially 3 railroad lines, the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the Milwaukee Road, which ran parallel. And they ran parallel because the government gave the people who were building the railroads a lot of free land to put these railroads up. I mean, the government was very interventionist at that stage, and of course has continued to be so. If you look at the ARPANET in the 20th century, would be the obvious example in your particular field. That state intervention has always been rather common. There was lax enforcement of anti-corruption. People criticized the East Asian economies after the Asian crisis for practicing crony capitalism. But if you're running around Wall Street in the 1890s, that's when really you had crony capitalism, and that was another aspect of the American model. The same model was, of course, applied by the East Asian economies in one or another way during the during the latter part of the 20th century. In East Asia, you had very strong restrictions on foreign capital inflows, both portfolio investment, which means buying bonds, basically, and foreign direct investment. Both Japan and Korea, for example, had very strong restrictions on foreign direct investment and preferred to develop the technologies on their own, beg, borrow, or steal, so that they were not open. The fact that China and India maintained capital controls up to the late 1990s was basically the reason why they avoided the Asian crisis, which hit the other countries, of course, as we all know, very hard. So you get that kind of a sort of theoretical background. Now, if you asked what happened in the world economy, which is another sort of background, piece of background that I'd like to bring up, if you look at the world economy in the period, say, from 1950 until the early 1970s, and exactly when you want to break off is unclear, but there was a so-called golden age, what is now called golden age, when most economies were growing fairly rapidly. And there was a sort of consensus view, so to speak, that the world was on a fast-track growth path, which would last forever. Of course, it did not last forever. Various things happened. The breakdown of the monetary system that had been set up at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in 1944, the oil shocks, increasing social tension, the golden age came to an end, at which point, as I'll illustrate a bit later on, you entered into the sort of present period of much slower growth and much worse performance on the part of developing countries. Just to give you one sort of background number that you may want to keep in your head, I'll talk a bit later on about productivity growth or per capita income growth, and there are all sorts of technicalities about how you do that, but how you measure that. But the standard number for OECD economies of per capita income growth or productivity growth is something like 2% per year. During the golden age, productivity growth in the rich countries was on the order of 4% per year, and some poor countries were maintaining rates of productivity growth or per capita income growth of about that same level. As you'll see a bit further on, that has ceased to be the case. There are two major shocks for developing countries that hit them around the end of the golden age. First was a shift in commodity terms of trade. Most developing countries were in the business, and still are to a certain extent, of exporting primary commodities. That is things like coffee and cocoa and metal products. And the terms of trade essentially refer to the price, word terms of trade refers to the price of those kinds of commodities. Beginning around 1980, there was a long, prolonged adverse shift in the terms of trade against developing economies, which had a major impact on their performance, particularly in the very poor ones in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa and the Caribbean. Second thing that happened around 1980 was a sort of Paul Volcker interest rate shock, which was aimed at stopping so-called stagflation in the US economy. And real interest rates in the US went from rather negative values to something like 10 or 12% per year. That affected developing countries very strongly. Brazil at that stage was borrowing money in capital markets to run a trade deficit of something like 5% of GDP, which is high. I mean, the current level in the US is about 7, which is really abnormally high, but that's another story. In any case, Brazil was running a 5% trade deficit until around 1980 when the interest rate shock came. Basically they were told, well, we won't lend you any more money. You'll now start paying 10% real interest on the money that we have lent you. And by the way, pay right now. So basically, Brazil had to switch from something like a 5% trade deficit to a 5% trade surplus around 1980, and the economy has been stagnant ever since. So those were really enormous shifts that poor countries had to deal with. So the shocks, both the terms of trade and the interest rate shock, were on the order of 5 to 10% of GDP, which is a lot. Two more pieces of background, and then I'll sort of try to give you a quick review of the empirical numbers. During the Golden Age, economic policy in general, you could use the word Keynesian, was fairly interventionist in all countries around the world in one way or another. And in the poor countries, it was basically developmentalist along the lines that had originally been proposed by Smith and Hamilton. And the developmentalist policies had greater or lesser success in various parts of the world. In some places, they didn't work, simply. The government tried to intervene, and it failed. In other parts of the world, they worked fairly successfully. And again, the East Asian countries would be the major favorable example. And someplace in the middle, you would find countries like Brazil and Turkey, which did some things well and some things not so well. By the way, up until around 1990, I'll be talking about so-called developing countries. And then with the breakdown of the Soviet system, sort of you get transition economies joining the developing economies, and there are some similarities and some differences. But I can come back and pick up that. In any case, around 1980, the policy orientation reversed. The transition points in the rich countries were, of course, the administrations of Thatcher and Reagan, where you had an enormous reaction against the kind of policies that had been previously pursued. And in developing countries, transition economies, that took the form of what came to be called the Washington Consensus, which explicitly repudiated developmentalism, said you should not practice industrial policy, you should get rid of protection of domestic industries, you should open your economy to foreign capital inflows, and you essentially disable all the kinds of policies that countries had been pursuing up to that time. A sort of subsequent twist on the story has been the sort of introduction or invention of what are called the Millennium Development Goals, which are being pushed very hard by the very hard by the United Nations, and also Jeff Sachs has made himself famous by running around the world and proselytizing for the MDGs. Now, basically, they say what the goal of the MDGs, in some sense, is to put countries on the dole. The aim of the program, which, by the way, will not get funded, that's another story, but the aim of the program is essentially massive income transfers to try to help poor people directly. Now, if you go back, which is fine, except if you go back to Adam Smith and Alexander Hamilton, that's not obviously going to lead to fairly rapid income growth, which is the only way that poor people, in fact, can be made less poor. You can put them on a dole, but you're talking about countries absorbing transfers from abroad on the order of 10, 20% of GDP. Now, I happen to live not too far from Portland, Maine, so I chose Portland, Maine as an example to illustrate a couple of points of that. Portland is the biggest city in Maine, and its GMP, gross metropolitan product, is on the order of $20 billion, which keeps a few people employed in the Portland area. 20 billion, by the way, is somewhat larger than Kenya's whole GDP. So you have one small city in Maine with a product of sort of $20 billion, or one medium-sized city in Maine with a product of $20 billion. And you have one fairly populous African country with a product of $20 billion. And the basic reason why people in Kenya are a lot poorer than people in Portland, Maine, is that there's just not enough GDP to go around. So that's sort of one aspect. Now, think about Portland, a city of 250,000, or a metro area of 250,000. How could they possibly absorb a resource transfer of $2 billion per year? What can you do? There are only so many freeways you can build. There are only so many schools and hospitals and social workers and teachers that you can employ. I mean, you would really have to reconfigure the Portland economy rather dramatically for it to be able to absorb a resource transfer of $2 billion. But that's what the goal of the Millennium, that's what the Millennium Development Goals attempt to do. In the case of Kenya, of course, as I mentioned, you've got a population of 30 million sharing out that 20 billion of GDP, and that means Kenya is a very poor country. Yeah?
I'm a little confused by what you meant by absorb. Do you mean how easily could Portland withstand somebody taking $2 billion out of that economy, or?
No, the question is how could Portland absorb $2 billion? It's the other way around. That is, Portland would have to reconfigure its economy in such a way as to use an extra $2 billion. And that, that's a pretty major, if you sort of think through the details, that would be a pretty major shift. Yeah?
Isn't it a bit different to try to spread $2 billion of investment among 250,000 people versus $2 billion of investment among 30 million people?
The question is spreading the $2 billion across 250,000 people on one hand, or 30 million people on the other hand. And of course it would be much more, yeah, of course there's a big difference. But the point I wanted to make is that either way, just to get that money into the system, to figure out how you can spend it in some useful way, is pretty difficult. And of course, in Kenya with 30 million people, you could sort of spread out a dole, which is in fact what the MDGs will be doing. But trying to use it to develop increasing return sectors in a way, which is what they should be doing, is not what the programs are aimed at. Okay? All right, well, the next thing I would like to do is try to talk a little bit about what the historical growth performance in developing countries has been. And there are a few points that I'd like to make in terms of the data. First of all, as I mentioned, there was a big change in performance of developing economies around sometime around 1970, 1980. Prior to that period, after the Second World War, most economies in the world were doing pretty well. Then subsequent to that, you saw a big change in patterns of development, as I will illustrate in a moment. And there was what we called, my co-authors and I happen to call the Great Divergence, between one group of economies, which continued to grow quite rapidly, the Asian economies, and the rest of the developing and transition world. Now, in terms of going back again to Smith and Hamilton, what you found in the rapidly growing economies, or the economies that had sustained growth, was continual structural change in a variety of dimensions. That is, a growing economy changes structure. And of course, you can see that right here in this very building, which was not occupied by its present company, I guess, not so many years ago. And that, that's at the level of the $12 trillion US economy. That's not going to be that's not directly visible, but certainly very important. Google is structural change. And what you saw in the rapidly growing developing economies was ongoing structural change, which did not happen in the ones that were not growing. And that shows up in various dimensions, which I'll try to illustrate. Now, the stuff, I'm about to give you some illustrations of what I have in mind. And sort of, if you want a further reference, Most of the material I'll present appears in this year's World Economic and Social Survey out of the United Nations with somewhat different graphs and somewhat different labels, but it's basically the same story. But let me, before I get into that, let me give you a couple of slides of historical data. There's a guy named Angus Maddison who has essentially spent his lifetime putting together data about GDP in all the economies of the world, and in some cases now he's back into the 1500s, which are basically educated guesses and nothing more than that. Let me sort of give you a couple of illustrations of what the historical growth experience is. And also, this is a minor technical point which might be worth spending 1 minute about. These numbers that I'll present now in this slide and the next slide are in terms of so-called purchasing power parity, which is an attempt to correct GDP estimates to illustrate how much each country's real purchasing power is. And there's one example of that which works reasonably well, which would be the following. I don't know about Silicon Valley. Well, I can ask. Suppose you want to get a reasonably upmarket haircut in Silicon Valley. How much would it cost?
$20.
Upmarket? Well, you're really cheap out here. To make the numbers work out properly, the typical number for Manhattan, let's say, if you go to Midtown, would be something like 50, let's say. You might throw in a beard. Well, it depends if you're a man or a woman, but say you were to get that $50. Say you were to get that haircut in Midtown, that would cost you something like 50. Suppose you were to get an upmarket haircut in Mumbai at the current exchange rate. What would that be? A nickel. No. You go to the Taj Hotel and get a haircut. What's that going to cost? $20? Oh, probably 5. So essentially, I chose the numbers to make the arithmetic easy, obviously. But so what I'm saying is that the Manhattan haircut is $50 and the Mumbai haircut is 5. But it's the same thing, basically. Somebody just cut your hair. So what purchasing power parity calculations do is essentially revalue the labor of the Mumbai barber. So it's not, if not equal, it's much closer to the labor of the New York barber. So essentially, you revalue the GDP in poor countries upward to take account of the fact that if you're living in a poor country, it's much cheaper, so to speak, to buy a haircut than it is in New York. And you go through these comparisons. The difference, again, this factor of 10, what this graph illustrates are income ratios of poor countries to rich countries. And I don't know if you can read the legend, but it begins in 1820 and runs up to 1998. And in terms of PPP, these income ratios, this line going down is East Europe and the USSR, the upper dashed line going down. And what that's saying is, along about 1820, the income ratio between Eastern Europe and Western Europe was like 0.55. And it gradually went down to 0.20 over the long period, with a fairly precipitous drop beginning around 1980, when the Soviet growth model ran out of steam. But the main point I want to make is that these lines go down. That all the developing regions lost relative income in PPP terms and in sort of market price terms. All developing regions lost income dramatically in comparison to the developed countries. And that was mostly due to per capita income growth in the developed countries. That is, what this graph is hiding is that developing countries were fairly stagnant and developed countries continued to grow. Here is a sort of a diagram with more regions. for the period after around 1950. And again, the general trend is downward, with a few exceptions. This is East Asia, the tigers, which grew quite rapidly throughout the period. If you picked out Japan as a separate country, which I don't have here, they would have started up a bit sooner and actually grew a bit faster than East Asia. But all the other regions are essentially going down, with toward the end of the period, China and a few other regions beginning to catch up. But again, a picture of general slow growth and stagnation in the developing economies. Here's a picture of what happened to growth rates, not levels of income, but growth rates over the post-war period. And again, notice the fairly rapid growth in the golden age. These come from two separate databases, but they essentially give you the same results. You get fairly rapid growth until the golden age. You get the so-called lost decade, which actually lasted quite a bit longer than a decade beginning in the late 1970s. And then you get some recovery in the period since 2000. So that's the general picture of growth experience. And the next thing I'd like to do is look in a bit more detail at different regions. What you have here are the three major sectors of the economy. That is agriculture, mining and manufacturing, and public utilities for 12 regions across the developing world. If you do this at the country level, rather than a regional level, you get essentially the same story, but to keep the thing relatively compact, it's easier to work with different regions. You had, was a question? No. So basically what you have here, the tigers, Southeast Asia, China, and South Asia, which is basically India in the data. And those four regions grow quite rapidly. This data begins these data begin in 1970. You get fairly rapid growth in all sectors in these four regions, and you get fairly comparable growth in Central and Eastern Europe as well. Although they were on a roller coaster, they went up and then went violently down in the 1980s and then came back up. So we get a sustained growth group, a group that we called late recovery, which would be semi-industrialized Latin America. Actually, semi-industrialized Latin America in this particular set of data includes Turkey and South Africa as honorary members, but those economies are essentially similar. But in semi-industrialized, quote-unquote, Latin America, Central America, Caribbean, those four regions, you get sort of up and down performance. And then the rest of the world, former USSR, this data runs out in 2003, and if we went up to 2007, former USSR would look a bit better, but nonetheless, it's not spectacular. Two African groups, Middle East, African. Those particular regions just don't do very well at all. Let's see, is that where we are? Okay. You can also look at structural change. And we looked at only the broad sectors, but again, if you disaggregated to a more sectoral disaggregation, you would see the same story. So on the vertical axis, you've got the percentage change in agricultural output over the period 1970-2003. And basically, agriculture declines in all economies as they get richer. And on the horizontal axis, you've got per capita income growth. Now, the main thing I want to emphasize, you can run a regression, which is what that line indicates there. But regressions, as we all know, are quite sensitive to outliers. And if you take out the red regions, that is South Asia, Southeast Asia, tigers, and China, and also take out Central and Eastern Europe, if you were to sort of just block out those 5 regions where there is a consistent relationship between shrinking agricultural sector, per capita income growth, if you remove those countries from the sample, which I suppose I could do if I was very good with PowerPoint, then what you would see for the other regions is a blob. So if you look at the diagram in that way, what you see is a consistent relationship, consistent structural change in the rapidly growing regions, and nothing much at all going on in this sort of blob of countries off to the left. You get the same story with industry. Industry expands, and again, you have the 4 Asian countries standing out as outliers. Central and Eastern Europe doesn't stand out as clearly in this diagram, but that's because they were already over-industrialized anyway. And again, a consistent relationship for some parts of the world and a blob for the rest of the world. And as I say, if you actually did serious statistical analysis, as opposed to drawing pretty pictures, you would get essentially the same result. If you look at labor productivity, the way productivity is measured, which is extremely simple-minded. I mean, economists blabber a lot about technical change and how this is pushing technical change and that's not pushing technical change. But all you mean by labor productivity is basically just average output per worker or average output per person hour. And so it's a very simple-minded measure, but it's the only one that economists really know how to use. But again, you get a very similar picture. There is a little algebraic trick that one can use if you have a number of sectors in the economy to decompose productivity growth within sectors as opposed to productivity growth due to reallocation. What I mean by reallocation is that if, say, the industry sector has a higher average level of productivity, which it does, and if you move people from other sectors into industry, then you get a reallocation gain in the sense that, that people are moving from a low productivity to a high productivity sector. So, so the darker part of the bar shows the productivity gain within the sector, within the overall productivity growth within the economy in this case, and the lighter part shows reallocation gains. And notice again that in the rapidly growing economies, you get substantial productivity growth, mostly from sort of productivity growth within sectors, but also reallocation. And reallocation turned out to be quite important, in fact, in Southeast Asia, where you had rather large movement of people out of a very low productivity agricultural sector, had negative employment growth in a low productivity agricultural sector, with people moving to other parts of the economy. If you look at investment, this is a slightly different story in that there appears to be a consistent relationship across all economies. That is, capital formation does play a role, it seems, in supporting per capita income growth. But again, one could argue about causality, but that's not something that I particularly want to get into here. Education does not apparently make that much difference. Here you have sort of growth in average years of schooling on the vertical axis, and again, per capita growth on the horizontal. Quite clearly, the regression line, such as it is pretty flat. It's dominated by these economies out here. And then for the slow-growing economies, you get this kind of blob-like scatter of points, which would not basically tell you anything. So what that's saying, in a way, is that education begins to look like a necessary condition for economic growth. And certainly education is highly desirable on social grounds, but the direct input into economic performance appears to be fairly weak. Foreign direct investment, same story. Yeah?
For education, what would happen if you plotted the absolute amount of education rather than the increase of education?
The question is, if you look at the absolute, if you plot absolute education rather than change in education, what does the relationship look like? It's a little stronger. I mean, what people typically do is take the absolute level at the beginning of a certain, you compare countries for a certain period, and you look at initial absolute levels, and the relationship would be somewhat stronger. But again, it's subject to, all that is subject to complications. I mean, if you look at Sri Lanka, for example, Sri Lanka back in the 1950s, 1960s had very high levels of education, but very low growth. Brazil, before it ran into trouble in 1980, had very low levels of education, very high growth. So they're always outliers, and in a way, the outlier is a more interesting thing to look at than the sort of average that a regression picks up. Foreign direct investment, more or less a similar story. These are foreign direct investment shares in GDP. It's not clear what the appropriate metric would be, but notice, for example, that China, which is the big outlier in this case, over the period that's being considered here, had foreign direct investment on the order of 2.5%, 3% of GDP, which, given the size of the Chinese economy, is a big inflow of foreign direct investment. And they grew fast. Tigers also got a certain amount. Southeast Asia got a certain amount. Southeast Asia is assembly operations in Bangkok, for example. South Asia got very little. So again, you get this sort of blob of points and then some relationship among the outliers, but nothing very consistent across the whole sample. So just to sort of summarize the main points that I'm trying to make, that rapidly growing regions had significant sectoral output shifts. There was structural change. And the other regions did not. Labor productivity growth was high in the rapidly growing regions, was not terribly visible elsewhere. Yeah?
What are possible scenarios in which growth could be rapid without high productivity growth?
The question is, can you think of scenarios where growth would be rapid without high productivity growth?
It seems like almost, I wouldn't say tautological.
It is tautological. It is very close to being tautological. That is, if you talk about income growth per capita, the difference between per capita income growth and labor productivity growth basically has to do with labor force participation, which can change. But it is almost tautological that per capita income growth and labor productivity growth are associated with each other. An exception would be an oil pot country, let's say, where nobody's really working, but you can have high income growth without productivity growth. Yeah?
Rent-seeking countries like countries that collect the products of labor of other states working for them, like oil states in Egypt in Bangladesh times.
Yeah, the question, again, a question about sort of countries that live off rents. And the oil-producing countries would be certainly an example of that. Current Russia at this stage would be another example. Egypt, in a way, with the Suez Canal and the tourism, but that keeps people employed at least. Let's see, what else? So it's almost tautological, but nonetheless, it's probably capturing something. And the fact is that you get differential productivity growth rates across sectors, which I think we'll get to, and things like that is relatively important. And then capital stock growth does appear to be associated with economic growth overall. And again, the same points I've been making in terms of more education, high FDI, not a very obvious connection, and no visible structural change. Let me just talk a little bit about sectoral patterns of productivity growth, which in a way goes a little bit further in the direction of addressing some of the questions. Note, here's labor productivity in industry across countries. And again, notice that you have extremely high productivity gains in the rapidly growing economies. Yeah?
Just a question. Sub-Saharan Africa, the reallocation gains are negative?
Yeah, that basically says, well, it says, the question about Sub-Saharan Africa, that basically says that people are moving out of high productivity sectors into low productivity sectors because the economy is doing so badly. That is, in a way, what that is in many Sub-Saharan Africa countries is government bureaucrats going back to the country as their salary structure falls apart. I mean, you know, it's as serious as that. Middle East and Northern Africa, heaven knows what's going on there, but that's an odd collection of countries in any case. The main point, again, I wanted to emphasize, and notice the CIS, or former USSR, really highly negative productivity growth due to the economic collapse in the 1990s. But again, the point I want to make is you get clear productivity growth in industry, in the rapidly growing economies, much less performance in the others. Here's services, which is a somewhat similar story. And then you get another decomposition, which essentially says where is employment being generated. And the main point that I'd like to make here is that you get a lot of employment generation in services because that's where the jobs are. That is, if you think of the economic growth process in rather broad-ranging terms, the productivity gains are mostly, in terms of this particular aggregation, which in fact is fairly generally accepted, productivity gains actually happen to a large extent in industry and not so much in other sectors. Now, industry properly defined would also include sort of parts of service sectors, which also, particularly in rich countries, are the locus of productivity gains at this stage in time. But if you're talking about developing countries, to a large extent, you're still talking about industry. So you get high productivity gains in industry, but you get high employment gains in services. And again, without going through sort of fairly simple-minded algebra, one can show that a sector will gain in employment if its output per capita grows faster than its productivity. So that in industry, output per capita is not necessarily growing much above zero, but you're getting fairly high productivity gains. So that industry has never been a big generator of employment. But in services, if output per capita grows a lot faster than employment, then you would create jobs. And again, I suppose Google is a kind of a microcosm in the sense that output per capita, I'm sure productivity growth here is very high, but output per capita for the whole, across the whole US economy is extremely high in Google, and that's why Google is a job machine. But that is not necessarily true in other parts of the economy. So in a way, you have this sort of, you have to worry about what's going on in sort of both the increasing return sector, in this case industry, but also how you generate employment. And again, the points that I've been talking about, productivity growth arises in industry and service. Reallocation has been a major contributor only in Southeast Asia. Service sector generates employment. And the bottom line is that industry serves as the engine of productivity growth and services for employment. I have another set of decompositions here, which I think I'll skip over in the interest of time, sort of how you generate effective demand. And without going into the details, what comes out of these, of the diagrams that I skipped are essentially two things. One is that economies have greater or lesser degrees of flexibility. I mentioned greater or lesser degrees of macro flexibility, and how you get yourself to have macro flexibility is very much an open question. But if you say, look at Brazil, I mentioned previously that they had the adverse external shock of something like something between 5 and 10% of GDP around 1980. And the Brazilian economy has essentially been stagnant ever since. Korea absorbed shocks of equal magnitude in the transition from 1990 to 2000, and Korea is still performing very well. So Korea had a highly flexible economy in a way that is very hard to quantify. But that's certainly an important factor in the Korean development history. The other point that comes out of these slides that I skipped is the following, and that goes back to the Washington Consensus. What happens when an economy gets into trouble? Who comes to town to try to get the situation to straighten out?
It's on the slide.
It's on the slide. All right. The IMF comes to town. And what the IMF basically tells you to do is to run a recession. They have a well-designed toolkit for running recessions that they've developed over the last 40 years. And basically what running a recession is supposed to do is to improve the trade position. That is, if you run a recession, presumably you import a lot less and possibly export more. So you run a recession to improve your foreign trade position. That particular theory is called twin deficits, which sort of got a lot of press in the Reagan period. That is supposedly the U.S. trade deficit during the Reagan period got a lot worse because Reagan was running a big fiscal deficit, and then supposedly getting rid of the fiscal deficit would improve the trade position, which turned out not to work. And in general, that kind of interventionist policy does not work to improve trade positions, but nonetheless, it's still very much part of the Washington Consensus, which basically runs in the direction of trying to get economies to contract, and which is another problem that many of them face. So then, suppose you try to think about reversing these growth declines and eradicating poverty. And what can you say about macro linkages? And then you have this kind of simple-minded diagram that economists are fond of drawing, and we all think the arrows run in the direction that the arrows are pointing. But if anybody really knew how to do it, I don't think we'd actually have poor countries around the world. So in a way, this is a bit of a sham. But it does seem that, judging by history, the policies which attempt to stimulate productivity growth and policies which attempt to stimulate effective demand at least have some possibility of paying off. Now, if you try to stimulate effective demand, the IMF will come to town and tell you to stop. And so you're already running into kind of a barrier there. And depending on the sort of freedom of maneuver of the particular economy that you're talking about, some countries can do that better than others. Both China and India, large closed economies, have in fact been quite successful at stimulating effective demand. India's had a budget deficit on the order of 5 to 10% of GDP for the last 30 years, which sort of has had the IMF gnashing its teeth ever since the beginning. But in fact, that's been a reasonably successful policy. China does something similar as well. On productivity growth, I would argue that, again, it requires what history tends to tell you is that, as opposed to economic theory, or received standard economic theory, but what history tends to tell you is that it takes some degree of interventionist policy to stimulate industries which can generate productivity growth. Now, there are all kinds of pejorative descriptions that are applied to that kind of policy regime, sort of picking winners and crony capitalism and sort of other labels that sound rather similar. But the historical experience has been that economies that have, and here I should phrase what I'm trying to say fairly carefully, what historic experience tends to show is that economies that have grown consistently at 2, 3, 4% per capita have almost always practiced interventionist policies. There's certainly plenty of economies, on the other hand, which have practiced interventionist policies which haven't worked. So it's certainly not a sufficient condition. And then you can get into sort of logical difficulties about what you mean by a necessary condition. But certainly or enabling conditions, and certainly things like industrial policy, and probably things like education are enabling conditions or require conditions or something like that for growth. But you don't get growth in a laissez-faire environment. There's really no history of that. Yeah.
What are some examples of countries that have actually been laissez-faire?
There aren't any. So again, in a way, I'm talking about an empty box. But countries have been, I mean, among developing countries, say in the last 20 or 30 years, they've been pushed very strongly in the direction of laissez-faire. I mean, where the IMF and the World Bank reign supreme, which is basically in sub-Saharan Africa and small open economies all around the world, they've been pushed very hard in that direction, and nothing's happened. You could argue that Britain was fairly close to being laissez-faire, but even that's not true. So yeah, you're right. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable point of view. So in a way, the set of countries to which standard economic theory applies is pretty close to being a null set. And the inhabitants of that set, if there are any, would be poor open economies in the last 20, 30 years, and they're going nowhere. So, I mean, that's in a way what the history is telling you. The history is also telling you that you can have, as I mentioned, you can intervene too much, and that there's no question about that. But that's another story. In any case, what would be the important linkages in the fast growers? Well, the same points I've been mentioning before, that you see this industry service breakdown, and you see that policies were aimed at sectors, stimulating sectors with where you had a chance to get economies of scale. And also, one might add, where in the successful exporting economies, where you would have big demand for your export product. IT in India would be something of a contradiction to what I just said, in the sense that the government did not explicitly target IT, but certainly created enabling conditions by setting up the Indian Institutes of Technology and having an extremely highly educated, having a relatively large numerical number of highly educated people who spoke English. And that itself you could view as a successful result of sort of the policies that were invented by Nehru. But in the poor countries, in the present period, policymakers' hands have been tied to a large extent by the Washington Consensus. Countries that opened to capital inflows, not just in the Asian crisis, but all around the world, have been subject to extreme destabilizing macroeconomic shocks, which can derail a growth process for an extended period of time. And sort of a technical point about macroeconomic prices, which I can skip. Trade liberalization has been associated with industrialization and labor shedding. The MDG intervention appears to be the most, if it happens, which as I say it probably won't, appears to be largely palliative and boils down to putting countries on the dole, which is not the best place for a country to be. The sort of Kenya, Portland, Maine comparison that I was trying to make illustrates that you're not really going to eradicate poverty in an extreme sense, that is $1 or $2 a day kind of poverty. I mean, God knows there's poverty in Portland, Maine, but there's a big difference between that poverty and the poverty that you see in Kenya. And Kenya has no shot at looking like Portland, Maine, unless it has sustained per capita income growth for quite a few decades. And the question is, how would you try to make that happen? I think current policies are just not aimed at all in that direction. And whether or not they change, of course, is an open question, but it's not, in a way, a very promising prospect. It's not a good way to run the world. Yeah?
What countries are involved in the MDGs? What countries are doing them?
There's a group of countries that are HIPC countries, which basically mean they're very poor. And the MDG is aimed at them. It's basically countries with a big chunk of the population under $2 a day.
What I'm asking is who is giving the money? Who's on the other side getting paid? Who's coming up with these MDGs?
Well, in fact, the money is not going to happen.
Like whose idea was that?
Oh boy, there's a very complicated history there. Basically, the question was about where did the MDGs come from? You remember there was a Copenhagen Social Summit about 10 years ago? And what this is a story that the NGO people tell, that they essentially suggested something like the MDGs at this Copenhagen Social Summit, which was then basically taken over by the World Bank and the IMF, who say that they're very good at delivering money to poor people. And so, in a way, the prime motors were the Bretton Woods institutions, and then it was basically picked up subsequently by the UN, by Kofi Annan, with an aim of sort of directing a lot of money to poor countries. As I say, the money's not going to happen anyway. But in a way, the program is also badly misdirected because it's just aimed at a goal. Yeah.
So there's been some talk lately about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela replacing the World Bank as far as a resource for Latin American countries.
Yeah.
Using the liberalization.
Yeah.
Of that. Is there any sort of political cohesiveness to his money, or?
The question is, what would be the role of Venezuela, I guess, assuming the oil price stays high in alleviating poverty in Latin America? Well, let me tell you a story about that. I was actually working in Venezuela about 5 years ago when the price of oil was like $17 a barrel or something like that. Sort of, we were scratching our heads. At that point, I was talking to some guys in the finance ministry, and we were scratching our heads about, how the hell is this country going to work unless the price of oil goes up to 18 or 19. So price of oil gets up to 50 or 60, that covers a multitude of sins. I mean, Chavez has set up mechanisms not terribly effective to deliver some resources to poor people in Venezuela, and is trying to branch out into the rest of Latin America. But he has no coherent model. And I mean, more power to him. Anything that upsets the United States and Latin America is fine, but it won't, and he doesn't have that much money either if you actually sit down and talk serious numbers. So I don't think that, that's in a way something that will not be terribly visible. Although he could do a lot for Bolivia, let's say.
There's another talk coming in, so we should probably do just one more question. Yes, and then we'll be here to talk about.
No? Okay, well, thank you very much.